Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs Daily War Room Briefing. We are on day 59 of Israel's war with the terrorists in the Gaza Strip. It started back then on the 7th of October with the massacre of 1,200 people and the kidnapping of 240 people. Since then, we have seen 10,000 or so rockets being fired by the terrorists from Gaza into Israel, indiscriminately targeting Israel's civilian population. We have seen the terrorists fighting on all fronts, and Israel responding to that threat. Firstly, with an aerial offensive targeting many of the dozens of Hamas sites all over the Gaza Strip, and then with a ground offensive. To discuss all different types of aspects of this war, we are joined today with the JCPA president, Dr. Dan Diker, and with our special guest today, Professor Anne Bayefsky. And we'll be discussing a little bit more of the UN. Why does the UN so hate Israel? And why is basically the UN part of that war on Israel? We'll open it a little bit wider also to the international organizations, including possibly the International Red Cross. The update that we have to give of the hostages, obviously, that we've seen in the last week and a half, 10 days, many of the hostages being released, about half of the hostages being released, but there are still some 134 hostages being held in Gaza by the terrorists. Israel's ground operations and aerial operations have also extended out from the north, or extended down from the north towards the southern area to Khan Yunis and to Rafah, and they are now extending into all of those really strongholds of the Hamas in the southern area of the Gaza Strip. At the same time as this war is going on in the south, we're also experiencing the war in the north, this war of attrition against Hezbollah. Hezbollah, another one of Iran's proxies, firing rockets and anti-tank missiles at Israeli civilians. Yesterday, 11 people were hurt and injured, and the constant flow of missiles and rockets and anti-tank weaponry carrying on also today. We've also been seeing a continuation of the barrages of rockets being fired from Gaza. Whilst everyone is complaining that there is a humanitarian crisis going on in Gaza, food's running out, fuel's running out. What the Gazan terrorists don't seem to be running out of is rockets. And yesterday, if you'll remember, we found, or we published further, the finding 150 odd rockets that were held in a house of either an UNRWA employee or an UNRWA recipient of aid. So connecting in UNRWA and the UN organizations.
And we also remember the UNRWA affiliates were involved in the kidnapping and maintaining of hostages in Gaza.
Holding hostages. One of an UNRWA school teacher, so claimed one of the hostages, was held in the attic of an UNRWA school teacher. There he suffered from starvation. We're not giving out, obviously, the name of that victim, of that hostage. We actually do know the name of the hostage, but it's not for public publication.
So this really brings to the fore, Maurice, the importance of Professor Bayefsky, who has been one of the most consistent scholars and academicians and activists, frankly, who has been monitoring the violations of UN and affiliated agencies for many, many years. And it's a very, very important aspect of this total war, because what we're witnessing is a collapse of the basic responsibilities of the United Nations and its affiliated agencies, even according to its own founding charter. Professor Bayefsky, it's a really an honor to have you with us here to give us an international view, because when we talk about human rights, and you've been writing about human rights for decades, teaching about human rights, and calling to account the United Nations and its affiliated agencies, and this is a moment of moral clarity for the United Nations, because I think it's no exaggeration, Maurice, that the United Nations has behaved in an intolerable way, and I will go on record as saying that. I mean, even though we try to be we are objective here, but Professor Bayefsky has published many papers with the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, and now is really the time for the UN to be called to account by the international community for its behavior here, which is talk about delegitimization, double standards against Israel. This is really a moment to be reckoned with. Professor Bayefsky, your overall thinking as you are monitoring the situation from New York about the UN's behavior regarding the Hamas, regarding the Palestinian leadership and Israel.
Well, I think it's important to recognize from the start that this has always been a two-front or a two-sided war from the point of view of Palestinian terrorists. One on the ground, trying to kill as many Jews as possible and destroy the state of Israel, their stated goal. And secondly, to go to the United Nations to have their back, to protect them from scrutiny, to protect them from denunciation and accountability. So this war proceeded in exactly the same way. From October, I began to monitor very closely every major UN actor from October the 7th. And I published something within 3 days, a long list of all the things that the United Nations had done when the bodies are still being counted, the bodies of dead Jews are still being counted, even the line between Gaza and Israel was not secure. The assault was still continuing from the terrorists inside of Israel. And yet, right from the start, the United Nations was talking about Israel there should be all sides should protect civilians, even though Hamas's stated goal is to kill civilians, while Israel does exactly the opposite. Israel's stated goal, of course, is to protect civilians, both Israeli and Palestinian, wherever possible, however possible. But Hamas does exactly the opposite. The intent is clear, and yet the United Nations had their back from the day one. So I think if you just take the broad picture of what's going on at the United Nations, you have a UN Security Council whose responsibility, according to the UN Charter, is to protect international peace and security, has never condemned Hamas. Never. And you have a UN General Assembly, 193 states, that has not condemned Hamas. Now,
is that because Hamas is a non-state actor?
No, it's not because of that, because they do refer in the Security Council, they adopted a single resolution which called upon Hamas. It actually used for the first time ever the word Hamas and called upon them to release hostages. But what it wouldn't do is condemn them. It said, please, Hamas, would you? So no, they're fully capable of referring to Hamas. The other thing that is sometimes referred to in UN resolutions is the so-called de facto authorities. So no, they don't have any trouble with dealing with referring to Hamas politely and in terms which treat them as if they're an equal player, an equal moral voice. So you have the situation where the UN's leading bodies are refusing to condemn this absolutely horrific assault on Israel and on humankind, on humanity, the degradation, the abomination, the suffering by Israelis, and they can't even condemn them. So we have that from a broader perspective. The other thing that I think is really important to understand from the outset is this war by the United Nations against the state of Israel, with working hand in glove with the Palestinians, has been going on for a very long time. It didn't start on October 7th. It started a long time ago, where you have even if you think back to 1975, the UN General Assembly adopts a resolution saying Zionism is a form of racism, which means it's illegal, it's racist, it's a crime against humanity. And so Israel doesn't have the right to exist. That's 1975. In 1975, what people don't understand is the very next resolution created a body called the Committee on the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People. And that committee's job was to implement the Zionism is racism resolution. And in 1991, when the Zionism is racism resolution was finally rescinded, the first time ever by the General Assembly, they didn't rescind the body that was supposed to implement it. So for the last half a century, you have this committee of the General Assembly, full force trying to destroy the state of Israel. And this isn't, a long time ago. This is November the 29th, a few days ago. They held their annual meeting in solidarity with the Palestinian people, no solidarity with the Israeli people. And they mounted an exhibit in the front hall of the United Nations headquarters. It's in the public hall. It's where school kids and all the members of the public can go without any difficulty. And I'm just going to perhaps quote one sentence from it. Basically, it talks about I'm quoting from it. "We hope that our poets will see the beauty of the color red in roses rather than blood." It's a series of blood libels. We hope that a pregnant woman will give birth to living babies at the hospital and not dead children in front of a military checkpoint. It talks about Zionism having the point of Zionists, they said, is to engage in the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. So this is in the here and now, started years and decades ago, and yet is carrying on the full-throated assault on the state of Israel.
I just want to make sure that I've understood, and also for our audience. What you just said is that in 1975 there was a resolution equating Zionism to racism. That resolution then created a body to implement that resolution. The resolution was killed, but for the last 35 years odd, the body that still implements that same resolution still continues to function. Who's funding that body? How can it possibly be that when its basis was really ripped out from underneath it, how can it be that that UN body is still functioning? I want to put
the underlying assumption was not ripped out underneath it. Actually, matter of fact, in 1991, because of the pressure of the first Bush administration, especially former Defense Minister Cheney, who at that time was quite instrumental in having the UN General Assembly Resolution 3379 tabled. It was not actually, and if I'm not mistaken, it wasn't wiped off the books, but it was tabled indefinitely, and therefore it was not actually torn out from the legacy or the protocols of the United Nations. But it was tabled.
It was rescinded. It's the first time ever it's been rescinded. But what doesn't matter that it was rescinded was, number one, as Maurice said, the body to implement it kept going. Number two, it was repeated by the Durban Declaration. So they repeated in a anti-racism so-called global conference in 2001 that there was only one state on the planet guilty of racism, and that was the Jewish state. So they singled out Jews for being the racist perpetrators in the world today by name, Israel by name. And so they simply regurgitated it in another forum. And but in particular, in the hallways of the the headquarters of the United Nations today, it says Israel's guilty of apartheid. That's what it says on the walls. So what we have is the body is keeps going. I was asked, who's funding it, and the answer is the United Nations is funding it, so that 25% of the regular budget of the United Nations is paid for by the American taxpayer. So it's key to keeping this monstrosity, anti-human rights, pro-anti-Semitism institution chugging along, not just chugging along, actually exploding. And there's a couple of other factors that I think are terribly important to understand about the UN today, and the consequences of what happened after October the 7th. And that is, no UN organization, no major player at the United Nations has called what happened on October the 7th anti-Semitism. I mean, the idea is that killing Jews in the here and now for being Jewish in the state of Israel is not called anti-Semitism. It's quintessential anti-Semitism. It's the worst form of anti-Semitism. It's murder, rape, torture, beheading. You can go through its horrifying list. And yet the United Nations can't manage to call it anti-Semitism. Why? Because it involves Israelis. And so there's this fiction. People are upset about what's happening on campuses in the United States. But that they're prepared to call sometimes anti-Semitism or a form of anti-Semitism as a reaction to October the 7th or a reaction to the war in Gaza, but not what's happening to Israelis in the here and now. So there's a few other things, if I might, and that is to understand this as a war by the United Nations to destroy the state of Israel, nothing less than just that. And how do we know that? Well, at the UN Human Rights Council on Monday, October the 9th, they were in session at the Human Rights Council, and the Pakistani ambassador on behalf of the Organization of Islamic Conference said, we need a moment of silence for the victims of and for 75 years of occupation and so on. He spoke specifically in terms of the original crime going back to the creation of the state of Israel. And everybody stood up. The Germans stood up when he asked for everybody to stand for a moment of silence. So this is the Craig McIver, who was at the time the highest ranking human rights official by the United Nations, in New York, the deputy high commissioner, the deputy in charge of the UN's Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights at UN headquarters. And he said on his way out the door that he called for this one state solution. And how did he said the two states are dead. We need one state, and that one state should, in his words, be a model of equality. Why? What's the justification for no states anymore, or no two states anymore? Equality for Muslims, Christians, and Jews. And that's eminently reasonable. We need equality. Now, if we think about that, and I think people are unable to parse it, that's 57 Muslim states he wants, 22 Arab states, and 0 Jewish states in the name of equality. So it's almost incomprehensible. What we think we have to stop and pause as to the perversion of the language of human rights by the United Nations to invoke equality, to commit genocide, the murder, the destruction of the state of Israel.
That's exactly what the Palestinian survey that was conducted among the Palestinians after the October 7th massacre came to exactly the same conclusions. Also, the Palestinians want a one-state solution in which there are no Jews. That's what their goal is. They say it quite clearly in the poll. They're offered three different options: a two-state solution, which almost no one supports; a one-state solution with Jewish sovereignty and Jewish leadership, which they outright reject. And they too support this one-state solution. That's really the whole body, UNRWA. That's its whole function in life, is to really to continue and eternalize this idea of the return of the Palestinian refugees, that they will come and demographically and democratically destroy Israel. That's their goal.
Well, I think you should be
renaming
the one-state solution. Really is a matter of nomenclature, and it might be referred to as the final solution in the minds of those that are advocating for it. And I think that, and it seems there's an issue here. There are two issues. One is Israel's hesitation, traditionally, consistently, to call out the rejection of, the uprooting of, the dissolution of Zionism as a fundamental act of Jew erasure. There has been generally, for various reasons, a hesitation on the part of Israeli governments to call out what you have been calling out as a Jewish American Zionist professor, what is properly called Jew hatred, anti-Semitism. And it has been, unfortunately, and I can say, having now been in Israel for less time actually than Maurice Hirsch, but 34 years, there has generally been a hesitation to merge the two concepts consistently as essentially Jew hatred, because the UN and other international agencies have viewed Jew hatred as a function of hatred and violence, whether rhetorical or physical, against the weaker party. Jews as weak, as the perceived weaker party, individual Jews, defenseless Jews, and the images of the Holocaust arise, images of the pogroms arise, images of what we understand as traditional anti-Semitism arise, and therefore everything else that we would define today as collective Jew hatred against sovereign Jews is viewed in the United Nations, I would submit to you, as political. And if it's political, it can't be anti-Semitism.
Well, they have a lot of excuses for not calling it anti-Semitism. And Israel has been, in some respects, part of the reluctance to call it anti-Semitism. I think that has been changing over the past few years, but it's long overdue. But I think that let's talk about politics. The UN Charter says that every UN member state has an inherent right of self-defense. But right now there's an exception clause, and that exception clause is for the state of Israel. Everybody has a right of self-defense, but Jews and the Jewish people. So how do I know that? Because till today, since October the 7th, no major UN actor has said Israel has a UN Charter right of self-defense. It's absolutely shocking. There was a UN Security Council resolution, just one, that the United States refused to veto, which refused, because it was part of the possible drafts, to say that Israel had a charter right of self-defense, an Article 51, as they call it, right of self-defense. It's almost unbelievable, except if you understand the depth of depravity of anti-Semitism, anti-Semites, and their control of the United Nations bodies. There's a number of things that have to be, I think, appreciated in that context. Is why did the United States not veto a resolution that failed to condemn Hamas and failed to specifically acknowledge Israel's right of self-defense? And the answer to that, I'm afraid, is that the Biden administration is playing a very dangerous game talking out of two sides of its mouth at the same time. It's using the United Nations as a sword of Damocles hanging over Israel's head. And that's just a plain fact. As much as Israel, many in the United States and in Congress are fully supportive of Israel's right of self-defense, the fact is, and understand that it's an abomination to analogize Hamas to Israel, which is the UN formula, the sort of so-called cycle of violence. All parties should now lay down their arms, even though one party's raison d'etre is to engage in the military destruction of the other side. The United States ambassador and on last week, when the resolution, I take that back. Last week at the Security Council resolution, just a few days ago, Linda Thomas Greenfield, and I'm going to quote her, said, she talked about a two-state solution, et cetera, and she said, and we have to guarantee Palestinians realizing their legitimate aspirations. She said, this is the only way to end this cycle of violence. That's disgusting. The fact that the United States ambassador thinks that October 7th, and everything that entails, and Israel's fighting back under rocket fire, by the way, which of course has never stopped, is a cycle of violence. One perpetrates aggression in the most egregious form, and the other one is attempting to destroy the enemy, which has a specific dedicated goal to destroy the Jewish state and Jews everywhere. Calls it a cycle of violence. So that was heard loud and clear by the rest of the members of the Security Council, a packed audience. It's webcast around the world. And so we talked about moral clarity to begin with. That's what the United Nations does. It guts humanity of our moral compass. And the fact that the United States is encouraging that kind of lack of moral clarity is it's really completely unacceptable, and they should be called out on it fast and furiously. The other thing to note is the role of the so-called Commission of Inquiry, headed by Nave Pillay, the former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. This COI, as it's called, which I've written about on the JCPA website from the outset, is dedicated, again, to the demonization of Israel as a racist state. Pillay herself has already said Israel's guilty of apartheid, which is a crime against humanity. Any apartheid state should be dismantled. So when she says Israel's guilty of apartheid, that's no accident. That's not just a kind of a offhand criticism of its human rights record. So the COI, with this, with members who say that the Jewish lobby controls social media and so on, that Jews throw around the word anti-Semitism like rice at a wedding. These are the members of the COI, the so-called human rights experts in quotation marks. They got a bit of a problem, namely the almost unimaginable rape and violation of the rights of women by Hamas, the use of rape as and sexual violence as a weapon of war. Now, the facts came out right from the beginning, and in fact, Hamas videotaped it and put it on the internet. I mean, we could see it in real time, almost in real time. I mean, within days. And yet, Francesca Albanese, the UN's so-called special rapporteur on Israel, who masquerades as a human rights expert, actually had the audacity to question the veracity of Hamas's sexual violation of Jews. And then what happened? Well, days and days and days and days. Now, 2 months later, UN Women has now said, we're very upset. We denounce Hamas's use of rape as a weapon of war. 2 months later, under pressure, with calls for them to resign, finally they say something to that's not true of the other. That's the COI Nave Pillay says it needs to be investigated. She's busy investigating what her lying eyes are telling her. So, but the rest of the UN, the mammoth UN apparatus dedicated to the protection of the rights of women, silent, dead silent. So you have the COI, they're in trouble. You know, how do they look? How do they regain their credibility? Well, they've actually decided that they're going to be the ones investigating the sexual violation of the rights of women's rights, of Israeli women, of Jewish women.
They can do that, right, Anne, because they just have an unlimited mandate to do whatever they want in order to make sure that they vilify Israel.
Yes, that's right. They can decide to investigate whatever they want to. They have this open-ended mandate forever, with in perpetuity, no end date. And the United States is paying for it. You know, members of Congress have called out the COI, the Commission of Inquiry, but to this day, the American taxpayer and Congress has failed to turn off the tap. How dare they require American citizens to pay for this disgusting, despicable effort to destroy the Jewish state through the Commission of Inquiry, and its failure, its egregious failure to call out human rights violation. Make no mistake, when they think Israel has done something wrong, they issue a press release within 24 hours. So the fact that they still haven't issued a press release about Palestinian rape and mutilation of Israeli women is deliberate. And which brings me to the last point, and that is the International Criminal Court. It's not just the COI. The Commission of Inquiry works side by side with the International Criminal Court. Now, the International Criminal Court, we have to remember, was created by a treaty in 1998 was when it was drafted, and it has a special clause in it written for a party of one, namely Israel. So it's supposed to be about rule of law, but it's actually the inverse of the rule of law, which is to call out or to create a criminal act which was designed to delegitimize and to criminalize any Israeli, anybody supporting an Israeli government, non-governmental corporation of any kind, where Jews lived in land where Palestinians said they can't. In order to create their apartheid Palestine, they say that Jews living in certain areas are not allowed to, not subject to negotiation, not subject to a final status agreement between the parties. No. The UN has decided where the borders will be, or the temporary borders until they destroy the state of Israel will be. And so what you have is this Rome Statute with its targets set on a party of one. And then you have the last 20 years. They spent over a decade about the effort by Turkey and to as you recall, break the barrier that Israel had created between in the ocean so that Iran wasn't able to set up a depot for weapons on the Gaza side of the Mediterranean. And 8 or 9 people were killed in the course of Israel trying to ensure that depot for weapons was not created. And the International Criminal Court spent over a decade trying to figure out, even though they're supposed to be dedicated to the most egregious violations of human rights, whether those 8 or 9 people had been, Israel had violated the rights of those individuals. Of course, it was absolutely the reverse. They were trying to kill the Israelis that boarded the ship. But for all that, the Palestinians understand that criminalizing Israel will be an effective tool in dismantling it. How do you prevent Israel from exercising its right of self-defense? Well, you take the heads of the IDF and the Prime Minister and the Supreme Court judges and the Ministry of Defense, and you throw them in a jail in The Hague. So you manufacture a faux law that will require universal jurisdiction, that if an Israeli IDF soldier travels to any place in Europe, they can be arrested. That's the goal. So in that context, Israel has consistently rejected the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court over Israeli soldiers. Israel hasn't ratified the treaty. It's upends international law to suggest that in the absence of ratification, that criminal jurisdiction should apply to Israelis. And so Israel has rejected its jurisdiction. So then what happened? Well, the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court decided that they have she at the time believed they did have jurisdiction, went to the court to argue that they had jurisdiction, and the court agreed. So there is this issue of complementarity, which means if Israel will too.
Sorry to interrupt. Basically, what the court did there, if I understand correctly, is that they invented a state of Palestine that doesn't exist, not factually, not anywhere else, to actually say, as part of the decision of the majority of the court, that there is this fiction that the state exists, and therefore they have jurisdiction. And that's something which doesn't seem to be changing. The court saying, well, we have jurisdiction. There is this state, at least on paper, that we're calling a state, even though it has no clear boundaries, no borders, no effective control over anything ostensibly. And yet the court still managed to say that that's the direction. Karim Khan, the prosecutor, was actually running around in the area just recently. He visited Egypt to try and get in through to Gaza through the Rafah crossing, and he was just recently in Israel speaking to victims of the October 7 massacre, and also then meeting with Mahmoud Abbas. Now, I just have to put this in context for you, Dan. Excuse me. One of the things that the prosecutor said, even the previous prosecutor, Bensouda, who decided to invent the State of Palestine and to go after Israel, she said that there exists a prima facie claim that one of the practices of the Palestinian Authority, at least one of them, gives rise to criminal responsibility. What is that? The pay-for-slay policy. So now you have the head of the court, the head of the prosecution, meeting with Mahmoud Abbas. Mahmoud Abbas, his legacy in life, that will be when Mahmoud Abbas leaves the stage, his legacy for the Palestinian people will be the pay-for-slay policy. And now Karim Khan is meeting with really the head of the state. He is the head of this criminal organization that is incentivizing, rewarding, paying money to murder Jews, including to the participants in the October 7 massacre. And Karim Khan is meeting with this guy as if he's on the same footing as Prime Minister Netanyahu.
Well, we've seen that trend since 2000, certainly, well, frankly, since 1974, when the PLO was admitted as an observer at the UN, and then in 2012 they were admitted as a non-member observer state. So we see an increasing amount of moral parity between the PLO, a self-proclaimed terror organization, and the State of Israel. And even more so, and let's go back to Professor Bayefsky, the Hamas has accrued an extraordinary amount of legitimacy, even as the Hamas in the international community. Witness President Barack Obama offered, the first time in American history, in modern political history, to mediate in 2014 between the Hamas and the State of Israel. And then in 2018, of course, you had the Great March of Return, which was then celebrated in the West as a moderation of the Hamas. The 2021 Hamas jihad against Israel was also actually cheered on and sympathized with even some far left Jewish groups in the West. So you see this increasing, and I'm actually sort of teeing this up for your comment. There's actually been a pathway of legitimacy even for the Hamas, not to mention the PLO opposite Israel.
It's worse than that. Before we go to Professor Bayefsky, one of the people that she mentioned, Francesca Albanese, not only did she not recognize Israel's legitimate right to self-defense, she actually categorically stated that Israel has no right to self-defense. That means that she is saying that the Hamas terrorists are entitled to slaughter Jews with impunity. And she is the special rapporteur of the UN Human Rights Council. So it's not only giving them credence and recognition, it's actually justifying and allowing their practices of murder.
Okay, and what is your view on all of this?
Well, I'm afraid, distressed that Israel took the decision to admit Karim Khan, the ICC prosecutor, into Israel. I don't quite understand. I do understand, of course, the terrible suffering of the hostages and their families, and the effort or the feeling of having to grasp at every conceivable option to release them, to end that suffering, although it may be lifelong, will undoubtedly be lifelong. Nevertheless, we should not have any illusion that the International Criminal Court and the prosecutor are going to attempt to criminalize Israel's self-defense and the so-called settlements, which, depending on who's speaking, include most of the State of Israel, if not all of it. So we have emboldened, legitimized the prosecutor by permitting his entry and facilitating his meeting with, as Maurice pointed out, the head of an organization that pays, whose number one accomplishment is to pay Palestinians to kill Jews. So that's a problem, and we won't hear the end of it. It isn't going away. It's where this whole trajectory is headed to move from the Commission of Inquiry and the likes of Nave Pillay and her band of her group to move to, they say it quite openly, they're sending everything they get on all the Israeli criminal behavior. They have been for the last 2.5 years directly to the International Criminal Court. They've gone there repeatedly. They're meeting with them. There's little happy faces of them smiling in The Hague with the ICC representatives. And so that's where we're going with it. But I think not only do they fail to acknowledge that Israel has a right of self-defense. There are major UN actors that deny Israel has a right of self-defense, as we've just pointed out. But that's why I go back in terms of this moral equation and this legitimization of Hamas, which you asked me. I just go back to October the 7th. We're talking October the 7th. The UN Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process, Touro Institute, says, I urge maximum restraint and call on all sides to protect civilians. I mean, we just have one side that had only one goal, and that's to not protect civilians. That's its raison d'etre. That's why it exists, to kill Jews. And you're calling on it to protect civilians, to pretend. And then you have
on that note, Dan, it's important to point out that in Israel there are 22 different UN organizations. 18 of them have a physical presence here. One of those physical presence here is Touro Institute, that Professor Bayefsky just referred to. He sits here in Jerusalem, in Almona Nativ, and calls on Israel to show restraint as 1,200 Jews were being massacred, raped, butchered, and beheaded.
At 5 a.m. on October the 7th.
You know, and I think,
I mean, 5 a.m. New York time.
Yeah.
So we're talking within hours. And I just want to point out, because I don't want him to, you know, not to recall this individual, Volker Turk, UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. We're talking, so 7 o'clock New York time, which would have been roughly on October the 7th, 2 in the afternoon, right? In Israeli time. And it had just started. He says, I appeal to all sides to avoid further bloodshed. Okay. And then you have Albanese, few hours later, October 7th. Today's violence must be put in context. Then you have the General Assembly President. Again, we're talking within 12 hours on October the 7th, the beginning of it. I urge all parties to refrain from future further violence and to seek a path to peace. And then you have Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General. He didn't just, by the way, come up with this contextualization of Hamas, 30 days later. No. He said he urged maximum restraint. That means Israel has no right of self-defense on the day of October the 7th. But then he said, and it's important to understand what he said exactly on Monday, October the 9th. This is the General Assembly, the Security Council. He says, while I recognize, here he goes. He says, I recognize the legitimate grievances of the Palestinian people. This is October the 9th. He says, this most recent violence does not come in a vacuum. The reality is that it grows out of a long-standing conflict. This is a vicious circle of bloodshed. That's 2 days after October the 7th.
Jews are being butchered by Palestinian terrorists, by Gazan terrorists, raped, murdered, beheaded, babies, women, children. And it's all happening in the context of, well, they have legitimate claims against the Jews, and multiple statements like that.
So let me ask a question here, and yeah. we've outlined the complaint, and now we have to seek the remedy because we only have a couple of minutes left. What is the downside versus the upside of Israel simply expelling some of these UN representatives the way it recalls or expels diplomats when they make outrageous statements reflecting great immorality? 1, 2, what would be the downside of Israel leaving the UN as a member state in protest, and even submitting that the United States leave the United Nations? Because as Alan Baker has said, the UN has ultra-virus its own charter in its prejudicial and discriminatory relationship with the state of Israel. And at some point, one has to say, how masochistic does a member state have to be before it recognizes that it has been erased, defamed, dehumanized, delegitimized, and rejected by the very organization that claims it as a member?
There are two answers to that. One is that, or three things. The General Assembly is currently in its major fall session. It will adopt another approximately 15 resolutions condemning the state of Israel. More resolutions against Israel than the rest of the world, the human rights it will condemn Israel for human rights violations more than the rest of the world combined. Okay, that's the UN's major body. And they will be adopted by an overwhelming majority. So what we know about the United Nations has this automatic majority of countries which are aligned against the state of Israel. But when they held an emergency special session on the events of October the 7th and thereafter, and adopted a resolution that failed to recognize Israel's self-defense and failed to condemn Hamas, the Germans, the Canadians, the Australians, the British only abstained. Now, so that's shocking, but it tells you the danger of the United Nations. It perverts the moral compass, not only for Israel, but also for democracies and freedom lovers everywhere. So how can we get out from underneath this vicious situation? And the answer is that the United States taxpayer has to stop paying for it. Because in the end of the day, Israel leaving is a tiny blip and nobody gives a damn. What matters is that the United States understand that when a Security Council can't even condemn Hamas and won't recognize Israel's right of self-defense overtly, that something terrible is going on, and it hurts not only Israel. Of course, it begins with the Jews, but as we all know, it doesn't end with the Jews. And so the fact that our allies, our strongest allies, have lost their way via the United Nations, protect the United Nations over protecting their own gut instincts as to what's right and wrong, tells us that we have to put an end to it by putting our money where our mouth is. That's number one. In terms of the capacity of UN apparatchiks able to work within Israel with impunity, shall we say, I don't understand it. Israel has long been the leading protector of UNRWA, knowing that even when the Congress was prepared to pull the plug, and the former president tried to defund it. Of course, that money went all back in with the current president. But Israel has said if the UN doesn't do it, then somehow we'll be left holding the ball. That's sad and pathetic because I don't see that. The pressure will be on for once, perhaps Arab states to step up and help their brethren, or other states to take responsibility for keeping Palestinians as refugees, as a political tool and a weapon of those who seek to defeat Israel by bloodshed. In terms of their other actors, they should be called out over and over and over again, and they have been in some respects. I mean, the current Israeli ambassador to the United Nations has called for the Secretary General Guterres, who has completely lost his any moral credibility, moral compass, he's just a guy on the side of the other side to resign. So there have been efforts, not enough.
As you know, Dan, I have been I have written repeatedly on the requirement for Israel to show a little bit of backbone and to call out these UN organizations and to throw them out, because they are a source of literally a cancerous growth, feeding all of this anti-Semitism constantly on a daily basis. I wrote recently that I had the opportunity to read a year long of reports from OCHA, and if I wasn't a Zionist, Dan, I too would have hated Israel. When you see the lies being spread over and over again, no context being given for any type of Jewish right to life, not even self-defense, to life. That's the product that you have from reading these reports. And so I would suggest that Israel really does take a stronger stance on that subject. Professor Bayefsky, thank you very much for your important contribution as we just to give you some of the influence of our viewers and the comments that we've heard during the conversation, that this is a blood boiling description of the actions of the United Nations, and I think that is quite probably the most accurate description. Thank you all for joining us. We have to wrap up now. We will be back with you again tomorrow at 4 o'clock Israel time, 9 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, and we will continue on with our discussions. Tomorrow we have a Lieutenant Colonel in the reserves, Dr. Anat Berko, who studied the whole phenomena of
female suicide bombers.
Female suicide bombers, exactly. And
member of Knesset,
former member of Knesset, and also someone who I also have a personal connection with. So that we will be on the agenda tomorrow. In the meantime, please stay safe, everyone. We will try to bring you up all the context and analysis that you need to understand what's going on around the world as part of the wider approach to diplomacy.